Oh my goodness.
Okay, so for the sake of our adoring fans out there in YouTube world and watching my channel, we're going to, I'm going to repeat what the assignment was so that this makes sense, so that when I post this online for other classes and stuff like that.
I like that. Yeah, that's good.
So you all are supposed to go out and find someone to interview that actually works in the field of sales. And I've asked you to find somebody that's in a field that you might be interested in. So for example, if you're interested in medical device sales, or if you're interested in pharmaceutical sales, to try and find somebody like that. You're supposed to interview that person and then figure out, what the challenges are to that field, what the barriers to entry may be, for example, in that field, how difficult it is to get into that field. And then, what it is that drives them and how are they successful in the field of sales. And to that end, so that you get good questions that you can ask, I've asked each group to come up with a list of 5 questions that you think are good questions and justify your answers. We talked about what are some of the questions that you're going to have to ask. They're not necessarily good questions, but you need to at least follow those up with, like, how did you get into sales? What's your biggest challenge in sales? Things like that. Those are not terribly interesting questions. What are terribly interesting questions? Well, I gave you a couple of examples of those, like how much time do you spend a day prospecting, and what are the techniques that you use to prospect in the industry in which you work? So those are kinds of things that are good questions. So we have a couple of groups that have indicated that they got their 5 questions. So we'll start with this group right here. I'll let you all get up and justify your questions. And then we'll probably have to finish this on Thursday. Finish discussing this on Thursday. Also, for those of you who are not here, last Thursday, I have found a video from a previous semester in which I go over the sales presentation. I have posted that on D2L in the contents section under Module 1. And I also sent out an email on D2L for you to get to that link so you can look at that. All right, so go ahead.
Okay. So we are Erasable Inc.
Erasable Inc.
And our first question is, what is your #1 disqualifying factor for potential prospects?
Okay, so the first question was, what is first or most, what?
Your #1 disqualifying factor for potential prospects.
Okay.
And the justification for that is see if they're even qualified to buy from you.
Okay, now this is a good question. Why? Give us your justification.
Because prospecting is one of the more important parts of sales, and a lot of people would be able to tell what they do to prospect and all that, but not a lot will tell like what's the one thing that they know they can just move on to the next one.
So I agree with you that this is a good question. And I think it's also a good question. You've come up with a fairly decent rationale. But I think another reason that it's a great question is that if you are spending a lot of time on a prospect that doesn't have, they may have the want, they may have the desire, but if they don't have the money, you need to move on, right? Another reason that this is a great question is that businesses are becoming aware that they don't want every customer. Some customers cost more money than they're worth. Now, generally speaking, one of the things that we say in sales is that it is easier to keep a customer than it is to prospect for a customer. Prospecting is expensive, but you don't necessarily want every customer. And there's a good example of this. Amazon Prime. If you send too many things back, and they will not tell you, by the way, what that threshold is, they will blackball you. They will cut your Amazon Prime account off, and you will not have Amazon Prime. And it's almost impossible to get it back. So, and they don't tell you what it is. But what they found is that there's a number, there are people who just order stuff and send it back. And if you're one of those that does that constantly, they will cut you off, and you will not have Amazon Prime. And that's going to be a big deal going forward in the future as more and more stuff is, Amazon is becoming the world's largest retailer. They are in a position to supplant Walmart as the world's largest retailer. Okay, so I think that's a very good question. What is your second question?
Next question we would do is, how do you adapt to a sales pitch that's gone downhill?
Okay.
So justifying that one, I think it's for, so you can kind of get some insight as to some other tactics used to kind of reel people back in if you've started to lose them, so you don't potentially lose having that business come on board.
Okay. Is there ever a time in which it's completely just irreparably broken?
I'm sure there probably is.
Yeah, probably.
Maybe it depends on how good the salesperson is.
Okay.
I don't think so.
You what?
I don't think there's ever a time where it goes horribly wrong that it's not available right then. I think right then and there you might get a no, but if you're a consistent person and keep contacting them, you'll get the yes later.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Until they buy.
The
Okay.
downside of that is once you annoy them, then they write you off forever. I'm never buying any of your products.
I did have, when I was in the private sector, I had a saleswoman who worked for me. She was a VP of sales. And she actually was the most annoying person I've ever met in my entire life. And she did sell, and I think she sold because people bought product to get rid of her. I mean, like literally, I think that they bought to get her out of their office. You know?
Yep.
And we were not selling, Doritos out of the back of a van. We were selling, educational software. But I think they would just to get her out of the office, right?
Did you get a lot of returns?
It wasn't a product that she returned. She was good at, once you bought our product, you were pretty well committed. It's like D2L. Once we bought D2L, we were pretty well committed for 10 years. Because we just don't have the ability to switch that quickly. The switching costs on things like learning management systems are so great. She was successful at browbeating them into buying more titles, not necessarily getting the initial learning, the LMS. So once they bought it, they were pretty well committed. That makes sense.
Nice.
Okay, what's your third question?
The third question was, which one did you guys do? No, that's the second one. Oh, okay. What three qualities are required in a successful salesperson? And then our justification was that we believe that everybody has unique qualities.
You think so?
I don't think so.
Really?
No.
Maybe not.
You think, okay, so going along with that idea, you think that I can take somebody, now I've made an argument at the beginning of this class last Tuesday, a week ago from today, that everyone sells something. And that's true. Everyone sells it, unless you just decide you're going to go live on the mountain and live off the land and not have any communication with anybody. You're going to have to go to work. Most people have to go to work and make a living. There are very few people that can afford to just not work, right? So everybody sells something, but do you think that I can take somebody who is just horribly introverted and make them into a salesperson? Somebody who's just got agoraphobia, that's a fear of going outside, and make them into a salesperson?
I guess
You could.
I guess, yeah.
It just depends on that person.
Yeah, I guess that is true. In this day and age, you could have a job where you basically are you're the chat troll on somebody's website, right?
Yeah.
So when you go to these websites now, if you've gone to a car dealer's website, these little things pop up and they ask you, some of those are bots, right? What's the difference between, and I'm using the pejorative term for them. Some of them are probably troll. I mean, they're salespeople. We use the terms bots and trolls in terms of the political context. So what's a bot in the online environment?
Program.
Like automated.
Yeah, it's an artificial intelligence that's used. So it's used in political campaigns now. It's becoming, the Russians, for example, are accused of, and I think fairly credibly accused of using bots in the 2016 presidential election to try and get people. So it's basically an artificial intelligence program that will repost stuff that they find are trending to try and persuade people. For example, in the 2016 election, the Russians were trying to persuade people to vote for Donald Trump and against Hillary Clinton. So they were picking up these artificial intelligence, these bots were picking up things like, for example, there was a totally hoax story that Bill and Hillary Clinton were running a child sex
Oh, yeah.
ring out of not a Pizza Hut, it was a pizza parlor
Hmm.
in Northern Virginia, right? And these bots picked that up and then rebroadcast it, right? So what are trolls? Well, Russia actually has a troll farm in Russia where these are live people that are out there posting stuff to the internet to try and get followers and get people to be persuaded for things. So I'm using the pejorative term. So when you go on a car dealer's website, for example, there now, I think, I've been on a car dealer's to see if this happens when I wake up in the middle of the night because I have insomnia. I start surfing the web for stuff, and I get on car dealers' websites because I like to look at cars. And it pops up and says, "Hello, would you like to chat?" I'm relatively certain that John Vance Motors in Guthrie doesn't have somebody sitting down there at 1 a.m. That this is an artificial intelligence, feature that's going to say, come in for a test drive, or we'd love to see you, based on what you sort of put in to the thing. So yeah, I suppose even somebody who's horribly agoraphobic now could have a job and I think we will go to companies where companies will have people 24/7 sitting there being live, sort of chat salespeople. Okay, what's your fourth question?
Knowing what you know now, if you were to go back in time, what industry would you choose? Business to customer, wholesaling, and then justification would be their point of view. And from the time that they started to the time now, what would be their go-to?
Okay. Would you change? Would you do something different? All right. I think that's a good question. One of the follow-ups you might come up with is, how difficult is it to break in? So for example, if you go into one of the things that almost everybody will tell you that they start out in sales in something like car sales or something like that. Lots of B2B salespeople, if they see that on your resume, they're not going to hire you because they figure you're already ruined. That's a totally different type of, that's the older model of selling in many instances, although it shouldn't be. And they're just going to assume, like, we can't fix you. So I've got companies that will say that. They will not hire. And then I've got other companies. US Foods is one that will not hire anybody that doesn't have at least 7 years experience, and they don't care what it's in. They can be in car sales. They won't hire. US Foods won't hire our graduates. I've tried to get them. I'm like, you really are missing out. You're getting people that are not necessarily tainted by what they've learned somewhere else, some bad habit. Okay, what's your fifth one?
What's the number one way to handle any rejections in the industry? And justification for that is handling rejections could be an indicator of successfulness.
Okay, all right. I think that's a good question. And this is a good question because we will talk about ways of dealing with objections and rejection, ways to overcome that, to increase your likelihood of success and being able to sort of come back around and maybe pick up something when it's gone horribly wrong and bring that person back, rehabilitate the sale. I think there is a point at which you probably can't. You've made somebody so mad that they won't. Although, again, I have a friend who he's now a manager, sales manager for US Foods. When he went to work for US Foods, he was assigned a territory, and there was a restaurant. It was assigned Western Oklahoma in the Panhandle, and there was a restaurant out there that had a very bad experience with US Foods in the past, and was absolutely insistent that they were not going to switch from I think that was Cisco to US Foods. And he went in every week and said, I know you've said that you're not going to use US Foods because you didn't like my predecessor in this territory. Here's my card if you ever have a problem. And finally, they had a problem. And he was able to deliver where Cisco was not in a critical time and they switched. So maybe it is possible to rehabilitate. All right, very good job, good questions. Good deal. We'll start with one more group. You guys said you had your 5 over there, is that right? So we'll start, we may not get all the way through with yours. You have them?
Also,
Everybody has to go up.
yeah.
All right, so what was your group name again?
The chosen.
The Chosen. All right. So your first question.
Say it better. No, the one that.
So our first question is, how do you develop your products inventory to sell? And justification is like when you go to sell something, you have to be able to to adjust to the person who's selling to. So you have to be able to explain like the idea behind the product that you're selling.
Okay. All right, and I think that's a good question as well, because one of the things that we know is that the salespeople often are one of the critical links back to the business in terms of what's going on. Most businesses experience changes in the market and they have to respond to that. And it's salespeople who are usually the first ones out there because they're dealing with the customers on a day-to-day basis and know what it is that they're going to want. And so it's oftentimes product ideas don't necessarily just come from formal research and development. In many instances they do, and in many instances they come from even mistakes. And one of the greatest examples of a mistake was in 3M. So what is one of the products that you all use that 3M is known for? Post-it notes, absolutely. Post-it notes. That's one of the products that 3M is known for that you all use. What is it that 3M largely manufactures then? They manufacture adhesives, right? So tape is an adhesive, but that's what 3M is sort of known for is manufacturing adhesives. They had a scientist who came up with an adhesive that wasn't terribly adhesive, right? I mean, it's not, if you've used a Post-it note, which everybody in here should have used a Post-it note, they developed, it was like, well, what are we going to do with this adhesive that's not terribly adhesive? Well, when you pull it off of another piece of paper, it doesn't tear. You can re-stick it on things, right? So, but since that development of the Post-it note, the original one, they now have come up with entire lines along the Post-it note. It's not just a little sticky note on a 3x5 card. They've got tiny Post-it notes. They've got big Post-it notes. They've got flags. They've got different colors. They've got pins. So as you're writing, you can flag if you're taking notes as a student. For those of you who take notes, you can pull the flag out. That's a Post-it note product and tape it to your, lecture notes or to your textbook and follow along. And so that development occurred. The original Post-it adhesive occurred as a result of mistake in formal research and development. But I would be willing to bet that a lot of the subsequent iterations of that came about from contact with consumers. And who has that contact with consumers? Well, it's the salespeople that come up with that and generate ideas and trends in the market. So, for example, the company that I worked for, one of the things that we noticed was it depended on where you were, what kinds of titles were really, really necessary to go into schools. And the biggest ones, for example, in poor performing schools that they needed help with were math scores, because that's one of the things that's the easiest to quantify And it's also sometimes in many instances the hardest if you have a limited amount of time to teach. And so we developed really good products, really good math products in our LMS to assess students' abilities and then provide remediation for them. And that came about from the salespeople in the field telling us, this is what teachers are telling us we need to have. All right, so we're out of time, so remind me next time that the chosen have got to finish theirs, and we will pick up with that, and then we'll start talking about sales within the context of the marketing discipline.
Yeah, it's cheap.
How do you develop products? How do you develop?
Okay. I'm sure you can find some.
Yeah. It doesn't matter.
Oh, yeah. I just didn't realize there was actually good D and egg.
So like, if you don't know what teaches it, you're not, it's a lot of like the people that are in that class.